Hello, this is Dr. Jianing Chen from BNU HKBU USC. This is my course of Studies of Contemporary Chinese Linguistics. Welcome back to my course. And this is Chapter 7 about first language acquisition. Here's the outline of this chapter. In this chapter, I'm going to talk about the definition of first language acquisition and nature versus nurture. And then I'm going to introduce two theories, which are nativism and constructivism. They are respectively concerning the innate whereas environmental influence on first language acquisition. Then I'm going to talk about the language development of children language acquisition. And finally, I'll give two examples of the acquisition of standard Chinese about pronunciation and direction of verbs. Okay, let's get started. First, let's consider some basic questions. As we all know, babies are not born talking. They acquire language starting from birth. Let's think of how to integrate language with other modes of communication for babies, and how to make them understood and how to understand others for babies. How does this process take place? What steps do they go through as they learn to understand and talk? Do the language they learn affect the way they think? For example, Chinese or English language, do they have different effects? Okay, let's talk about first language acquisition first. When learning a first language, children could build on pre-existing notions of what to represent the idea in their minds with language, or they could start from nothing and discover what is represented in language. These are two possibilities you can consider. Acquisition might be affected by the property of each language, social interaction, and cognitive development of children. The type of language could influence the order in which children acquire specific parts of language and could also make some elements harder or easier to acquire. Consider, for Chinese, for example, tones are very important. How tones affect language acquisition. There are two very important concepts about first language acquisition, which are nurture versus nature. So nature is any innate capacity and structures that children have or children were born with. Nurture means what they gain from experience. So let's consider, do children come with innate learning mechanism of language by nature, or are such mechanisms generally purposed aid to learning or specific to language alone, or a part of the whole capacity of growing up? And whether children are born with built-in linguistic categories and structures required for learning. There are debates on built-in linguistic categories and structures. There are at least three typical opinions. Let's consider which make more sense. The first, children come with syntactic categories like noun and verb already in. That means they already have their concept or the ability of such differentiation innate, along with certain structural arrays for combining them by birth. Second, children discover noun and verbs by looking at all the linguistic context each word occurred in, which means they learn the ability to distinguish nouns and verbs in the language context. And finally, they can discover nouns and verbs from the kind of things they designate. Nouns are for people, for place, for things, and verbs for actions. So what makes more sense for you of these three opinions? Now you need to consider the difficulties in learning a language by a child. It is something beyond your imagination. Children face particular intrinsic tasks for learning a language. because it demands highly complex system, sound, vocabulary, syntactic construction, word structure, and function assigned to each element. So learners must master both structure and function in order to use the language. Okay, about above problems, there are two main theories on children's language acquisition research, including nativism versus constructivism. Let's introduce them one by one. First, about linguistic nativism. They believe that there is a concept of universal grammar, which is a theory of the innate biological component of language faculty. They believe that the innate constraints is the grammar of a possible human language. And when linguistic stimuli are received in the course of language acquisition, children adopt specific syntactic rules that conform to universal grammar. Universal grammar is something innate, and it needs experimental investigation to determine precisely what properties are universal for all human beings and what linguistic capacity are innate. So it demands further study. And it is about innateness hypothesis. Actually, it's compare language acquisition with other innate biological-based behavior. For example, including sucking, eating, grasping objects, crawling, sitting, walking, and all of them have contained common characteristics as following. For example, those behaviors appear before it is necessary for survival. It has happened naturally, and it does not appear in response to the environment, and it is not a result of a conscious decision. Children do not do it intentionally. It happens something naturally. It is not a result of formal education or training either. In fact, the formal instruction has very little effect. It's not necessary to teach the child of such activities. The behavior appears in predictable sequence, in order, in a particular order, which is common for all human beings at a certain stage of development. Learn to do something, sucking and eating sometimes, and then naturally grasp the ability to do other things in the state of development. And the behavior appears at a critical period, which means a particular time period is very important, very essential, because after that period, it will be difficult or impossible to learn that behavior, especially for language acquisition. So in this case, scholars believe that there are some language acquisition device inside the body as a human being member. Such device theory refers to the theoretical area of hardwiring in the brain of children that propel them to acquire language, a particular place, area in the brain. For example, here is a profile picture of the people's brain hemisphere. There are different regions in charge of a different function. Those colored regions here listed in this page are something related to language activity. For example, the Broca area, the yellow area on this page here, plays a central role in speech generation and language processing. Suppose if the Broca area of a child or of a person damaged, particular language ability could be affected or destroyed. And also, since the development of a linguistic ability developed during a particular stage of the whole process. And it is very important for some critical period. So there is a critical period hypothesis. Says, language acquisition device cease to function and ability to acquire language with native fluency decline as childhood process and disappearing after the age of puberty. That means as the age grew up, the ability to acquire another language decline. As shown on this page, the learning new language gets harder with age. The statistics here are collected from the immigrants to the United States. The older the age at immigration, the poorer the mastery of second language of the language speaker. And as shown here, after the puberty, the ability to master another language declined dramatically. And there's opposing opinion, which we can call it constructivism. Believes that individual or learner do not acquire knowledge and understanding by passively perceiving it. Rather, they construct new understanding and knowledge through experience, integrating new information with prior knowledge. The origin of this theory is linked to Swiss developmental psychologist Jean Piaget's theory of the cognitive development. Professor Piaget's theory of stages of cognitive development is shown here. It means there are several stages for the cognitive development of a child. Typical abilities have grasped naturally without learning for different stages of children. For example, below 2 years old, the coordination of sense with motor response, sensory curiosity about a word, language used by demanding and cataloging object performance is developed. And later, for the stage of preoperational, means the children with the age of 2 through 7 years old, they develop a symbolic thinking, use the proper syntax and grammar to express concepts. And later, during the concrete optional period, people belong to 7 through 11 years old. The concept attached to concrete situation, and they have the idea, the concept of time, space, and quality. They can understand them and apply them, but not as independent concepts. And later is the formal optional period. It refers to the children with the 11 years old and beyond. So according to this theory, language ability is developed naturally during the process of development because of the environment primarily. And here are their typical opinions. We call them interactionist and cognitive function linguists. Some of the scholars of the constructivism hold the interactivist hypothesis, believing that children acquire language by their innate language abilities to extract the rules of the language from their environment and construct the phonology, syntax, and semantics of their native language, while cognitive functional linguists believe that language acquisition is not a separate process of the children's development with a distinct language acquisition device in the brain as proposed by the nativist, but rather a result of the children's general cognitive and intellectual development as a part of the general development as a whole. And these two opinions actually focus more on different questions of the children's language acquisition. For example, nativist theory study more or ask more on a question like why children can learn language while other animals cannot. The difference between human baby and baby animal. What inborn quality do children have that lead them to be able to use language within 3 or 4 years? Early period of growing up. Well, constructivism theories ask that how children can progress from being unable to speak to use language the same way as adults, or they ask what have children experienced that cause their language to develop. And these two theories hold different opinion on the initial stage of children's language. For example, nativist theory believes that it is not blank, but rather an inborn knowledge of grammar inside the baby's brain, which is the essential reason why children acquire language. An animal baby cannot. While the constructivist theory believes that children's language is gradually constructed based on general cognitive ability through interaction with adults. And language input the children receive during the interaction is an important driving factor. And they have different judgment criteria for acquisition. Also, for example, when answer whether to use correct comprehension or correct production as the criterion, they answer differently. Nativist theory believes that once children can understand the contents of a certain discourse, then they have acquired discourse. It's not necessary for the children to speak out, as long as they understand the conversation. While constructivist theory believes that it's need to observe the interaction between children and adults to see how children gradually construct language. The children not only need to understand the words, but also need to speak out, say the words, marks the grasp of the language. Besides, there is a dual mechanism theory, integrating the above two theories, which believe that universal grammar is obtained by children through inheritance, innate, while the lexicon and their programmatic use are influenced by the linguistic environment and stored through memory. So both make sense, both matters. They emphasize the innate and the environmental influence as well. They believe that if children do not have a proper language environment after birth, it is equally impossible for them to speak. An innate genetic factor and the empirical influence of a language environment are both dispensable in language acquisition, and it is difficult for them to negate each other. So what is the role of input in children's language acquisition? We believe that it is impossible for children to learn to speak without being triggered by input. So input, the linguistic environment, enough information provided for the children is very important. And also, children have the ability to discover patterns, and they can find rules from many sentences provided by adults. The adults tend not to tell or teach the rules, for example, syntactic rules, to children directly. But on the other hand, the children find the patterns themselves by listening and understanding numerous sentences. I think this is the difference between acquisition and learning also. For example, if you compare the first language acquisition and second language learning, while the later, in most cases, teachers need to tell or teach the rules especially syntactic rules or phonological rules even to the students. While for first language acquisition, babies tend to discover everything by themselves. Okay, let's further consider the input of language rules. Interaction between adults and children during their early childhood, the input of language rules that children receive is very little. That means adults tend not to teach young children how to speak or abstract rules. Sometimes we discover the children say something improperly or they make some grammatical mistakes. As long as we can understand them, we can understand their intention and meaning, we tend to allow their errors. While for second language learning, teachers usually point out the mistakes of the student. Okay, let's talk about the general principles and practical cases of children language acquisition, especially for standard Chinese. Here is the chart showing a typical stage or progress of early children grasping language, especially their pronunciation of the milestone experience. For example, for a 3-month baby, it's typical for them to pronounce gu or agu. This is the beginning of pronunciation of them, typically. And when they grow up to 6 months, sometimes they can pronounce or produce some strange sounds. We call them babbling, bab, 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 something like this. The movement of their lips, especially. And when they grow up to 9 months, they start to imitate the pronunciation of adults. And usually, a 1-year-old child can speak out 1 or 2 words, which is very simple. Typically, some sounds like mama or baba da da da, something like this. This is the reason why almost all the ethnics around the world name their mother as mama and their father as a dada or baba, because they are initial sounds, initial words that children tend to speak out during the process of their linguistic development. When a child is 18 months old, sometimes they can grasp some words, basic single words to express themselves, tend to use 1 word to express themselves. For example, in Chinese, fan or shui, they cannot pronounce words clearly, but they can use such words to express their intention or meaning. And 2-year-old baby tend to use 2-word phrase, 2-word phrase, verb and object. For example, 吃饭 or 吃糖, or something like this. And 3-year-old children can use 3-word phrase or more complex ones. They grasp the vocabulary of about 200 or even more. And after 4 years old, they can express more complex sentences and can communicate with adults more effectively. This is the general principle, general rules of their development of language ability. So typically we divide the stage of early childhood language development into several stages, including cooing and babbling. And holographic stage means the single word stage. And then 2-word stage, and later telegraphic speech, simple sentence. And then developed into the whole sentence stage. That means they grasp the language. Finally, and the chart on the right shows the sequence of consonants that children grasp in general for English. For example, English native speakers, babies, tend to grasp the consonants of p, m, h, n, u, b at first, and then k, g, d, t, m, and later f, y, and then l, s, later ch, ch, j, and so on and so forth. The sequence of grasping consonants of Chinese must be different to some extent. So different language has different difficulties and different stages and sequence of grasping those pronunciations. For example, the differentiation between zhi, chi, shi, and zi, si, si is something difficult for children. And also the pronunciation of the literal l, l is something difficult. There's a very interesting phenomenon which called overgeneralization. It tends to occur when children acquire a morphological or syntactical rules and then apply it too broadly, use too much of it. To those does not belong to such situation. For example, in Chinese context, some child might say 苹果们, 玩具们. This is right after the stage when they understand the meaning of 们 to imply implication of a plural noun. But they still do not understand the usage of it. 们 here cannot be used following things. They tend to use after person, personal noun. They still do not understand the programmatic usage of it now, so they make such mistakes. Similarly, in English, some babies say, we hold the baby rabbits. They still not understand hold it. The past tense of the hold it is hold is held instead of hold it.